Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, kia hiaki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Ko titirangi te maunga, ko wai Aotearoa, ko ngai tamatirangi, Ngāti Hine Waiatarua, me Ngāti Whaita ngā hapu, ko Ngāti Kahungunu ngā rauru, me Ngāti Raukawa ngā iwi, ko rangi ahua te marae. He kai pūtahi rangahau ahau, ko Kim Hamilton taku ingoa. Welcome to all and thanks for joining us this morning. I'd like to acknowledge the community groups and NGOs from throughout Aotearoa and also from those government agencies who are looking for insight to inform your work. I acknowledge those who are joining us from other countries around the world, and we appreciate that this is a time of many challenges for community organisations, whānau, Tamariki, and what Judge Andrew Beecroft has to share today is very relevant to how we can work to ensure that the voices of rangatahi and Tamariki who are often marginalised in our work are better integrated. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to log into the Community Research Facebook page and post any questions for Judge Beecroft today. If you would like to be notified when we're broadcasting our next webinar, please join our Facebook page and the Community Research discussion group. You can also subscribe to our monthly e-news by emailing communications@communityresearch.org.nz. So in today's webinar, we have a chance to learn more about what we can do as community organisations and in our research and evaluation to consider the voices of children and rangatahi in our services and support. His Honour Judge Andrew Beecroft will share insight into the work programme and strategy of the Children's Commission and roles for community organisations, community researchers and providers in making sure children's voices are heard. Born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, Judge Beecroft graduated from Auckland University in 1981 with a BA LLB honours degree. He assisted with the establishment of the Mangere Community Law Centre and worked there until 1993. In 2001, he became the Principal Youth Court Judge of New Zealand, and this is a role that he held until 2016 when he was appointed the Children's Commissioner. He's married with 3 children that he's very proud of, and Judge Beecroft is also a keen hurricane supporter and an average but enthusiastic participant in sports. He's strongly committed to a specialist approach in dealing with young offenders and is a strong advocate for youth issues. I would like to introduce our presenter for today's community research webinar, His Honour Judge Andrew Beecroft. Kia ora, Andrew.
Kia ora. Inga mana, inga reo, wa rangatira mā, mihi mai karanga mai. He pai ki te kōrero, kia koutou, I tēnei rā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Actually, you know, I have never spoken to a white wall in my life before. There's just a camera and a white wall. I was just reflecting. There are many of you listening. About 10 months ago, I was 15 kilometres to the east of Ruatoria, on a marae, where I met 14 boys, some of whom hadn't been in education for up to 4 years, all of whom hadn't been in education for at least 2 years. It was probably one of the most marginalised and remote spots in New Zealand, on the far east coast of Aotearoa. And I just think of those boys when I speak to you today, and I think of the particularly marginalised and alienated children in New Zealand, and there are too many of them. And while I speak at a white wall, I imagine those boys and I think, what can we do to ensure that they are not only in education, but have a future and a hope and will thrive and will flourish? So the first thing I do today is wear a t-shirt. So I take off my jacket, and I'm going to stop here, so don't panic. And here is the t-shirt. Some of you will know the story behind the t-shirt, but I'll put it on, and then we've got it enlarged on the PowerPoint. This is the story, and this is the picture. Now, if they were all in front of me, I would be asking you, who is it, where is it, when was it? Well, it's Martin Luther King, of course, and it's in Washington, D.C., and it's August 1963. Over 250,000 people had marched on Washington for justice. And the final keynote speaker was Martin Luther King. He actually had a prepared speech all ready to go. And he started on it. And it was on the theme of the Bank of Justice of the USA delivering a dud check for the black people of the States. Actually, I was telling this story last year to a group of 12-year-olds. And at this stage, they all looked a bit blank and started nudging each other and talking. And I suddenly realized they didn't know what I meant by check. I said, you know, a check where you write the dollar value and who it's going to and you sign your name? And not one of the 30 plus 12-year-olds had a clue what I was talking about when it came to a check. I'm sure most of you will. His theme was that a promissory note had been delivered to the black people of the USA, but had been returned, marked insufficient funds. And if you look on YouTube, you can see about 9 paragraphs into that prepared speech, Martin Luther King pauses. He clearly thought he wasn't connecting with his audience. I can't even see you to know if I'm connecting or not. But he had that awful feeling of over 250,000 people, and he thought he wasn't nailing it. And you can see him take his notes and put them to one side. And in that silence, one of his advisors, Mahalia Jackson, calls out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And she was referring to a speech that Martin Luther King gave a couple of months earlier in Detroit. The media were there. It never caught on. But on this occasion, he changed tack completely and he began on that speech again. But this time it caught on. It has reverberated down the decades. Children learn it today. Young people know some of it off by heart. Martin Luther King's dream, where black children and white children sit down together on the sweltering plains of injustice of the Mississippi Delta, where children are judged not by the content, or not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So I introduced today's webinar with a question for you all. What is your vision for Aotearoa's New Zealand children? What do you want for our children? How will your research and your insights further and develop children in New Zealand so they can flourish and thrive and prosper? Particularly our children who are Māori, because you are a tangata whenua research group. And actually someone challenged me a while ago and said, well, that's all very well to have a big dream, but what about an Aotearoa dream for our children? I thought, good idea. Another t-shirt. Another who is it, where is it question for you. And this asks for a bit of knowledge of New Zealand history. So here's the t-shirt. Well, you'll know who it is. Dame Whina Cooper. I think very close to Te Hapura, embarking in 1975 on the Land March. But her words, I think, are a terrific contextual New Zealand vision for our children. She says, take care of our children. I mean, could talk about what manakitanga means, an obsession in itself. Take care of our children. Take care of what they hear. Take care of what they see. Take care of what they feel. For how children grow, so will be the shape of Aotearoa. I think that threefold challenge in terms of looking after what children hear, see and feel is a terrific vision for New Zealand. And I guess what I want to cover today in general terms is what's going on for New Zealand's children and young people. Where are the opportunities, the research opportunities? As a starting comment, to be as understated and non-controversial as I can, in my view, the New Zealand government and government departments for 30 years at least have dropped the ball on developing child-focused policy, have dropped the ball on ensuring that children and young persons' views are taken into account in forming that policy. It's remarkable in a way. We are one of the most developed countries in the world with terrific resources, a terrific infrastructure, but the research on what children themselves say and their own views, in my view, has been woeful. And government departments up and down the country have really, I think, for reasons that are hard to pin down, maybe of the view that children are a work in progress. They will have views in the future. Maybe that it's a throwback to the Pakeha Victorian era of children seen but not heard. Maybe maybe everybody thinks we have been children. We know what's best. For whatever reason it is, not only has our policy failed to really take into account children's issues, but the research behind it has been poor, and it has seldom focused on children's views. Seldom has it prioritised going out and hearing what children say. And often when it has happened, the focus groups have been school prefects or community leaders who have a lot of social capital themselves. We have made it our business in this office, and I'm something of a recent convert to this, and I guess there's nothing worse than a new convert with evangelistic zeal. But hearing from children, particularly the most marginalised and alienated, offers terrific insights. Children always add value to research and policy. Children's views always improve our thinking. Minister Tolley was, I think, when she was reforming child, youth and family into what we now call Oranga Tamariki, to her eternal credit, she put together a group of care experienced children and asked them what they wanted. You know, they said at least two things that weren't even in the thinking at the time. First thing they said is, if we are removed from our families, why do you separate brothers and sisters? And you know, until that time, there had never been a legal principle that said sibling unity should be preserved. There is now, it's in the Act, it's in black and white. It took effect only a year or so ago because children asked for it and adults suddenly thought, we'd never thought of that. They also said, why do you dump us at 18th birthday? All our friends, if they are sick, have a university or job break or have a relationship breakdown, they can come home and regroup. We've got nowhere to go. Why do you drop us at 18? Why can't we have ongoing care to age 21 or 25? Again, that's now in the legislation because children asked for it. So I guess my starting point when we're looking at research is to say two things. Let's focus a lot more on what's good for children and young people in our research. And in doing that, let's design it in such a way that children and young people are heard. We did a research project about education and hearing from about 1,500 New Zealand kids across the board, but weighted towards those who were excluded, marginalised, alternative education, teen parent, LGBTQI. You know, it was fascinating what they said. For one thing, when we asked several open-ended questions, a recurring theme was children's experiences of racism. We don't often use that word as adults now. We dress it up as unconscious bias or discrimination or structural discrimination. Children and young people named it as racism. And it was a much clearer thread than we had realised. Many educationists have said how helped they were to hear what children and young people themselves said. So in conducting research, I guess a big challenge is, are we focusing on what good policy for children and young people are, and are we hearing from them? So with that said, this is what I'd like to briefly cover today. Just talk about children in New Zealand overall. 5 research challenges that I've got, and there could be a lot more, and I've just, I guess, been a little influenced by topics of the day, and some concluding comments. First question, I wish I could ask you to guess how many under 18-year-olds are there in New Zealand? I can't get bids from the audience. Sometimes I've had as low as 300,000 or as high as nearly 2 million. Actually, this is the answer. It's 1.123 million children, 23% of the population. It's a big group. Over 20% of that group are Māori. By 2030, it's forecast to be 30%. By 2048, Pacifica and Māori are forecast to be at least 50% of the under 18 population. It's already that now in parts of South Auckland. So any research that takes place now has got to be thinking of the future. It's going to be quite a different cohort of children and young people in Aotearoa in 20 years' time than is the case now. How well do those children do? Very simply, I would summarise it in 3 ways. 70% thrive and flourish and are in environments of relative economic stability. 20% are in genuine struggle street. They know significant economic hardship where families are really struggling and doing it tough. And 10% are in families of chronic intergenerational disadvantage. That equates to about 120 to 150,000 children and young people. Eden Park spectators filled twice over. Now, being in those groups roughly, and you can measure whether it's health or education or child poverty or well-being, it's a very similar rough summary, 70, 20, 10. I mean, being in those groups isn't an inevitable life script for either bad outcomes or good outcomes. All we can say is it raises the risks and increases the challenges for the 10% and the 20%. And as we all know and don't have to have reinforced, Māori, particularly Tamariki Māori, under 5s are disproportionately represented in that 10% and that 20%. That's our challenge as a country. I'm often asked what's behind it. You could write a thesis on that question. Suffice to say, it's not the New Zealand I grew up in. There is now more marginalisation, alienation. There's more width between the 70 and the 10% than there ever was when I was growing up in Kilburnie Primary School, Evans Bay Intermediate and Rangatahi College. It's a different and changed New Zealand. What's behind it? All I can do is put the slides up because I could talk about each one for about half an hour. But it won't surprise you to know that child and youth poverty, I think, because it raises the risk so high, is so fundamental. And it's something that happened, bang, in the late 80s, early 90s. No gradual change, it just hit us with the world economic shock and the mother of all budgets in New Zealand as a response. Benefits were slashed and child poverty went from about 7 or 8%, not acceptable, but manageable, to close to 30%, bang. And we've never recovered. And we've been asleep at the wheel pretty much ever since. We've never been set up better in a way recently. This government, cross-party, Mr. Bridges and Liz Ardern together, child poverty reduction legislation in place. a child and youth wellbeing strategy, a host of new initiatives put in place, free lunches from schools for many, could go on. COVID, in a sense, has wrecked it all. We were well placed this year, I think, to make some big changes. And COVID has put it on hold, but we cannot lose sight of that huge challenge to deal with that 10 and that 20%. In a way, COVID's made it worse. It's probably 60, 30, 10 now. You could write books on early intervention and we could talk about the C word for some time. But that enduring legacy of colonisation, systemic disadvantage with modern day systemic bias, what the children we surveyed would call racism, is a pretty lethal cocktail. So how well are we doing in New Zealand? In a sense, it depends who you ask. I think many of the 70%, if not oblivious, are relatively ignorant and unknowing of how it really is for that 10%. And we heard recently of many Pacifica students in school, leaving school early, not that they wanted to, but they did want to support their families who had lost jobs, to get work, or to care for younger children, not of school age, so parents could get different work. I mean, a terrific and quite inspiring example of loyalty and commitment to the family, but I think shortchanging in the process educational long-term prospects for those students. So it's a challenge for us in New Zealand. I don't think we're doing anything like as well as we used to think we were doing. And it's only in the last 3 to 5 years, I think the country's woken up to some of the real challenges facing our country. If Dame Fina Cooper is right, I think she is, researching and looking at children's issues is really nation building. And those of you who are wanting to do good research and get good insights for our communities and for our country, particularly from the perspective of children, are involved in nation building. I love this little quote. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. Well, in terms of knowing why a flower isn't blooming, why a child isn't thriving, in terms of what's the environment and what needs to change, who's better placed to do it than researchers? And in a sense, what better research than by Māori, for Māori, with Māori? And our chief Māori advisor, Dr. Kathy Irwin, would put me up against the wall if I didn't emphasise that starting point. How well are we doing? Another t-shirt. I vividly remember a young fellow walking into the Manukau Youth Court, taking off his hoodie and just standing there looking at me with this t-shirt that some of you might have seen, and he clearly wanted me to see it and he clearly wanted me to engage with it. And he just stood there, and I saw many t-shirts as a judge, but this is the one that most challenged me. Clearly, I wasn't quite the judge that he was hoping for. And I said to him, because we want to engage with children and young people. I mean, there's nothing better than talking and engaging with children and young people. And I said, well, that's an interesting t-shirt. He said, all good, boss. Then I said, well, it's a bit early, isn't it, to call yourself a criminal? I mean, that label, that's way early. You haven't even pleaded to the charge yet. We don't even know if you're guilty, if you did it. At this stage, his lawyer stood up and just quietly waved. Clearly wanted me to shut up, but I boxed on and said, you know, as a committed Christian myself, I understand what you're saying. I can't fault your theology. So I'm sorry, but you won't know what theology means. He said, yeah, I do, boss. It's about God stuff, isn't it? I said, yes. I said, on the other side of heaven, I firmly believe that there will be perfect youth justice. No argument. But I said, the bad news is today you stuck with me, Judge Beecroft in the Manukau Youth Court, and he smiled and he sort of burst out laughing, and then he reflectively said, well, I hope you get it right. I hope you get it right. Those words have stood with me. I use this t-shirt so often because I think for you as researchers, community-based researchers who want insights, are we getting it right? And we're not getting it right if we don't hear from children and young people and don't focus on the needs of that 23%. And we're not building a nation if our research isn't factoring that in. There's barely any area of research I could think of that doesn't relate, at least indirectly, to children and young people as well. And that's why I said, I think as a policy shaping country in New Zealand, we've dropped the ball in terms of focusing on and prioritising the views of children and young people. Incidentally, you should do some research as to where this quote comes from, the whole story in itself. And a young English teacher told me one time where it did come from, but we'll leave that for next time. Our priorities at the moment, just so you know, if we had to boil them down to 4, and in fact we have, they speak for themselves. That is where we are heading. In terms of our advocacy, we've got a staff now of nearly 35 full-time equivalents. 11 of our staff are Māori, 2 Pacifica as well. As an advocacy and monitoring group, we look hard at advocating for improved services, systems, supports for mokopuna Māori and their whānau. We want enhanced child well-being. We've got a big role by law to monitor Oranga Tamariki. People keep saying to me, why do you go on and on about Oranga Tamariki? Well, actually, that's our legal mandated job. We are to monitor and assess. That is, think about, weigh up, examine, think through the policies and practices of Oranga Tamariki. And in a sense, it's a challenging job. I mean, we are directed to call it as we see it. And frankly, I think the time has come to be looking at the dream has got to be more than a dream. It's got to be within our lifetimes a by Māori, for Māori approach where care and protection services of identification, assessment, prevention, assistance, support, long-term care are provided by and for Māori. There may always be a role for the state and sort of the forensic examination of serious abuse that needs instant, urgent help. But generally, we should be looking to the state shrinking in terms of its delivery services for Māori. There is a whole field of research, I think, developing and burgeoning in that area as to what by Māori, for Māori looks like, region by region. And we have a particular concern about education. So I'm leaving you now with 5 challenges to be ready by about 20 to 4. 5 key challenges that are, I guess, things that are top of mind for me now, with a particular emphasis on well-being, bearing in mind disproportionate, I guess, well-being rates in terms of health and education and involvement in Oranga Tamariki for Māori. And it's sort of seen through that perspective. And I start by repeating, whatever the research is, I hope it's designed to specifically scope out children and young persons' voices, and not just the select few who are always used and are good at it, and who are the head prefects and the sports captains. We've got 3 youth workers, highly ethically trained, assisting us all the time. That's how I got to, I think it was Ririporua Marae, East of Ruatoria. So I got to the Kaitaia REAP program. It's why I'm going to Wainuiamata on Wednesday, because we need people as researchers and advocates who are in communities where there is disadvantage and can help us hear from those communities in a way that isn't patronising or staged, but has good ethical principles and a good basis to it. I mean, when we asked about mothers and whānau experience with Oranga Tamariki, we knew that we would be opening some pretty deep and profound life issues and experiences. And we did. And we had to ensure that we had counsellors available and support available and that complaints processes were available. I mean, it took a lot out of the staff. The research that we did demanded all that some of the staff had. And we needed to provide counselling and support for them as well. So with that in mind, I'll just, I guess, focus on 5 areas, just to give a bit of background. I'll let you to read these stats. When I look at the third one down, the annual average has been recently 265 babies under 3 months of age taken into custody for the past 6 years. 171 of those on average have been Māori. There is a 64% disproportionality, is one way of putting it. We've got to be thinking, why is that? I mean, that can't be right. All the mothers we spoke to said, yes, we understood why the state was involved. We understood the issues going on in our lives that raised concern, but surely there is a better way. Surely. In my area of youth justice, I mean, at every stage of the process, in a sense, it gets worse for Māori in terms of being apprehended by the police. It's interesting, some people call it about offending rates. You can see per 10,000 14 to 16-year-olds, 652 Māori, 140 is the rate for European. Offending rates, actually, you can't measure offending rates because who knows absolutely who committed the offences. They're actually police apprehension rates. So even that figure is skewed by police practice, isn't it? You can understand that as researchers. Police catch who they find and perhaps catch who they target or catch who they find in areas where they're most present. But the disproportionality rate is massive. It means that while about 24% of the population under 14, 15, 16 are Māori, about 50% of those caught are Māori, and about 62% of those charged are Māori, about 70% of those who don't get bail are Māori, and we've got 4 staff now at a youth justice residence in Rotorua, Tamaiaha, where when I last went, of the 30 boys there, 29 were Māori. So there are some major questions for research as to why that disproportionality. We call them residences. Actually, they're much more like youth prisons. My view is we should be looking to their phased closure. There is a whole opportunity for research on the new Section 7AA in the Oranga Tamariki Act that says, in recognition of the treaty, Oranga Tamariki is required to enter into partnerships with iwi, Māori organisations and cultural authorities. It's just started. There's a whole research field as to how that is being done, what's being put in place. Has it resulted in measurable improved outcomes for Tamariki Māori? That's really the question. I mean, Oranga Tamariki should be lapping up invitations to research 7AA and its practice, and the law requires Oranga Tamariki in 7AA to respond to any request for partnership, which I think should involve research opportunities as well. I've talked about by Māori, for Māori, with Māori care and protection approach. The old model that we have now has failed. We're always seduced to doing new changes, but I think they're no more than putting band-aids on a leaky ship. Good people always think they can do better this time. Well, we've had 3 restructures, about 14 or 15 reviews. Frankly, on the evidence of 30 years, the time has come to look at a new paradigm or a new model. Certainly, genuine partnership, sort of envisaged by 7AA, is the first step. But there are abundant, I think, research opportunities there. And just as an aside, in our own office, we're about to appoint an assistant Māori Commissioner for Children, because it seems to me I have to at least be true to what I'm preaching and challenging others about, and to demonstrate in the office, our own office, a change of structure. So there's at least a small step towards power sharing and embedding a Te Ao Māori view into the DNA, as it were, of our office. There's been some really interesting calls from the minister, regarding justice, to the Ministry of Justice about a new model of justice. And there are 7 key themes. Now, there are research opportunities at every one of those 7 stepped themes. And I'll let you just reflect on that. In fact, in the youth court, thanks to the influx of about 10 Māori youth court judges, the concept of rangatahi courts, where young people, if they wish, have their cases heard and watched over on a marae with a judge and a group of kaumata and kuia, that's been a genuine attempt in a small way to put some of those 7 challenges into practice. I think there are opportunities in mental health. The recent Youth 2000 survey made clear that generally there had been a doubling of mental health issues amongst teenagers in the last 8 years, a doubling. No one's sure why that is. There's a whole field of youth and child mental health research. Another part that you don't need me to talk about that we research better, and I know that the Mental Health Review Committee looked at a by Māori, for Māori approach and are beginning to talk about what that is. But on the stats alone, a complete paradigm shift is justified. And finally, in education, we talk about the tramline effect. Whether it's decile 1, or in this case, quintile 1, or quintile 5, the most advantaged, quintile 1, the least advantaged, the gap between Māori in red and non-Māori achievement, sort of in an orangey colour, it remains the same. So the gap can't just be explained on socioeconomic grounds alone. Is there something wrong with the setting of the system so that in whatever school, whatever decile, whatever community, the gap between Māori and non-Māori achievement rates sort of remains the same, like a line that just goes up. Achievement rates go up as the deciles go up, but the gap remains the same. And there's really good evidence that even within quintile 1 and quintile 2, there are significant differences in achievement rates. And it seemed to be that kura kaupapa Māori models have much higher achievement rates. Some say that's because motivated parents send them there, and then those parents spend more time with their kids. Others say it's because of the resetting of the system, or it's both. And as a side issue, we don't know much in New Zealand, in that last point, about neurodevelopmental disorders. I know that's something of a Western construct when you're talking about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and ADHD, brain development issues, but I cannot find research, New Zealand research, that says whether the rates for those neurodevelopmental disorders are the same or different for Tamariki Māori, which I think is a crucial question. We have no research on prevalence rates in New Zealand on fetal alcohol disorder, none. Been a woeful hole in the Ministry of Health's research, and we badly need it. So in closing, I've talked about New Zealand children, the 1.123 million, 23% of our population, the 70, the 2010, the real need for research in care and protection, in youth justice, in health, mental health, education. We need some courage now as researchers to take, as it were, the bull by the horns and reprioritise children and young people and their voices. Let me close with two final t-shirts. Here's one that some of you may know the story of. '68, Mexico Olympics, the 200-metre medal ceremony. The story behind the t-shirt is that the American track team had decided they wouldn't turn up, but then they were persuaded to go to Mexico and to make a political statement, and they all agreed they would do the Black Power salute every time they won, but they all wimped out. But it came to the 200 metres. They were sure they'd be first, second, third, but an Australian, Peter Norman, came second. Tommy Smith was first, John Carlos was third, and somewhat concerned, straight after the race, they went to Peter Norman and said, we were going to do the Black Power salute, but this is your medal ceremony too. It was meant to be three United States athletes, but there's only two. How do you feel about it, Peter? He said, I stand with you. I'm a Salvation Army boy from Melbourne. I'm going to wear an Athletes Against Racism badge, which he did. You do it. It was then Tommy Smith said to Peter Norman, we've got a problem, by the way, Peter. John Carlos, who came third, forgot his gloves. So it was Peter Norman who said, well, Tommy, you've got to wear your glove on the right hand, which you'll see on the t-shirt. And John Carlos, you came third, you'll have to wear your glove on the left hand. And that's why they're on different hands, the gloves. Huge commotion. Smith and Carlos booted out of the games, never effectively ran for the States again. Peter Norman, on the other hand, ran the fourth fastest time in the world in 1972 to qualify for Munich. But Australian selectors wouldn't select him because he wore that Athletes Against Racism badge and supported what happened. And they selected no sprinters from Australia that year. It wrecked Peter Norman. He plunged into depression, became an alcoholic later in his life, died in about 2008, all told on a great DVD called Salute, the story of the Mexico 200 metres ceremony. And in it, you see the picture of his funeral in the Salvation Army Citadel in Melbourne. And his pallbearers, you can see, front right, front left, or at least they're pallbearers, are Tommy Smith and John Carlos. They flew all the way over because they said this man had courage of his convictions. He stood up for what he believed. He took some risks. He did things that few other white men then were prepared to do. And I think that is the challenge for all of us working with children and young people, to do things differently, to reset the paradigm, to show a genuine conviction for a different kind of research that really is nation building. And to quote Martin Luther King again, a young boy showed me this, if I cannot do great things, I can do small things. I can do good research in a great way. That will help change our country. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koe, Judge Beecroft. That was an amazing presentation. You've stirred up a whole bunch of questions for our participants, and I'll cover off a couple of little admin ones first off. Our participants want to know if the PowerPoint presentation will be available to us to send out to them later this week.
Absolutely, you can have it right now. There's nothing original in it. I've been a bit outspoken, I guess, but yes, have it by all means. It's
Thank
nothing
you.
I haven't said before, and use it, abuse it as you wish.
Yeah. Also, they've also asked about the T-shirts, some of the T-shirts in particular. I don't know if you recall where you purchased in particular the Awhina Cooper one.
Gifted to me by someone who heard me speak about a dream and said, you need a New Zealand dream, bro, and you're deficient. They came up with it. It was gifted to us, and we've got a few printed, I think. That's how it came.
Oh, that's great. I'm sure you can...
And to let the Lord judge the criminal, which is actually a quote from Tupac, not the Bible or Shakespeare. That came from the Aotearoa flea market, and the lawyer got it for me because I wanted a second copy. And the other two came from an Australian market in Melbourne, Victoria Market. I just saw them there and thought, right, that's what I can talk about.
It's great. It's great that you've been dressing up to the occasion and a different way of presenting your kōrero. I think we've got questions from Tony and Kerry around government departments who are worried about researchers involving children in research. And I guess the question there is really, how can we push back and encourage informed consent, but also perhaps look at strengths-based approaches to our evaluation and research in terms of partnering with government agencies?
Yeah, I utterly agree with that. I sometimes get criticised by putting too many stats in that emphasises a deficit-based approach and doesn't build on strengths. And I think that's a fair challenge that I've looked at, which is why I've tried to go and see, for instance, the marae I talked about on the coast east of Ruatoria. Etu whānau was there building strength amongst the family and the young people, because realistically there was one college there that all been excluded and there was nowhere else to go. And that was a genuine strength-based approach. I think the REAP program, Rural Education and
Activities Providers.
Activity Providers. Yep. I went there, I met a young fellow who knew that let the Lord judge the criminal quote. He knew that. He said, it sounds to me, he said reflectively, he hadn't been at school since about 15. He said, it sounds to me, he said reflectively, the kind of observation, he said, his words, that Tupac would make. I thought, boy, isn't there a wealth of ability in that young fellow who, for reasons I never quite got to the bottom of, had been excluded from school. Well, we talked, he wanted to be a lawyer. I sent him a project. I said, have a look at Good Will Hunting, that movie. Write to me about it. When I get it to you, I can arrange, because he wanted to be a lawyer, he said. I can get you to sit in a law school lecture and you can see what it's like. It's a long way, but we can talk about that. Strength-based, I absolutely agree. Government departments are the hardest to engage with in getting children's voices, but there's something of a sea change going on. Government departments are hearing the challenge. The Ministry of Education, being frank, they were the hardest to engage with, now they're the best. They're talking about how can we involve children in school governance issues. We've got to have more than just one token student on a board of trustees. What's a way of getting student voices into school governance and administration? There's some great thinking going on, but I entirely agree there's a challenge with government, but they're open to it more and more, and it's got to be strength-based. We all know the stats, and there's not much use in reciting them all the time, which is why I tried to keep the stats out of it from this presentation.
I think there was a bit of a kōrero from some of our panel, our attendees today, that perhaps some of the stats were a little bit optimistic in terms of the 70-20-10. But the other thing too that really struck a note with some of our viewers, Kate and Cherie made some suggestions around perhaps care and protection in Oranga Tamariki needs to be uncoupled. And if OT are only looking after the top 3% of children, what's happening to the other 27?
Yeah, and I think OT have got a huge job on their hands, and I'm not sure that for Māori, Tamariki Māori in particular, I am sure that the best care is delivered by wider whānau hapu iwi. And I think placement outside the culture of the child, for Indigenous Māori in particular, is demonstrably in the long run less effective in terms of development well-being than not being placed there. But I really do think that community-based care by iwi services, iwi organisations, Māori organisations is the way forward. And incidentally, we've advertised for our Assistant Māori Commissioner. Kath Irwin, Dr. Irwin helped us draft the job specification. We had about 31 applications. We're down to a long short list of a smaller group than that, and we're in the midst of finalising the process now.
So one of the other questions, Judge Beecroft, was around the place of the UNHR in your work. Do you have a reflection on that for our participants?
Yeah, if you mean the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which by law we are required to advocate for and to provide information about and to ensure government departments implement it, there's been a really good discussion in our office as to what extent it should, and it should and can harmonise with the Treaty of Waitangi. I think it's seen, understandably, as a Western construct, particularly a European construct. But it is a document that can harmonise, or with which the treaty can harmonise with. And it's too simplistic, I think, to say it's just a convention that individualises children and separates them from whānau, hapa and iwi. And there's plenty in the convention that provides for a deep respect of Indigenous culture and connection to whānau, hapa and iwi, although of course it doesn't use those words. So, I mean, it would be rewritten differently today, and it's not ideal for the Aotearoa Indigenous context, but it's not at odds with it. And we've produced one or two little papers where we've tried to think through that issue.
Yeah. There's been a couple of really great posts in the chat feed from people that are interested in bringing together Māori and Pacifica youth workers, and also people who are interested in supporting children in sports. So I'd encourage our participants to contact Adam and Christina around those. But we've also had questions posed to you, I guess, Judge Beecroft, around the voices of children in housing and environment, and also what's happening, you know, I guess the reflection on education and the digital divide, and how perhaps we can mitigate issues of those things with our planning, with our research.
Yeah, as to housing, I went to a Housing New Zealand conference a couple of years ago, and a very honest architect said, when I gave this sort of talk, they hadn't really thought about children, and then they did some research and got together some children in housing corp homes, and he said, I think his words were, it blew my mind as to what we were missing and hadn't thought of in terms of Housing New Zealand homes explicitly taking into account children's needs. And it was great to hear that, but it was also, I suppose, disappointing that for decades in the past, children's voices hadn't been heard in the design and architectural process. In terms of the digital divide, it's easy but true to say that COVID exacerbated the existing 70-20-10, and it got a lot worse for the 10%. And the Ministry of Education was saying to me that digital divide became even more pronounced during the provision of education during COVID, and that those who didn't have access to the internet or devices were badly affected in terms of keeping up, really were literally off the grid, both technologically and educationally. And I think all we can do to eradicate the digital divide in New Zealand, and we ought to be able to, and the quicker we can do it, the better.
Thank you. One of the there's a question in here, but I wonder if I could pose it to you as a suggestion. Do you think that we need to establish a Youth and Children's Research and Evaluation Ethics Committee?
What a great idea. I'm just spontaneously responding because that implies, I mean, the reason we haven't got that is we do so few researches about children and young people. To have that body would be really useful, I think. Accredited, trusted, that would make it so much easier, because we know there are issues with research with children and young people who are often vulnerable. Now, we need to do it carefully and well to a high ethical standard, but to have a body like the question proposes, I think would be a terrific step forward. And we realised we were a little light in that area, which is why we've got both youth workers and, dare I say it, lawyers who are focusing on a postgraduate approach on child and youth policy and research issues. And it's in itself, it's a growing field.
I think the context for that was really that people are saying that when they're trying to propose that youth and children are involved, the ethics committees lack perhaps the specialist knowledge to make sure that that work can continue. So often it's taken out of the proposals, perhaps.
I agree. That's what we found too, which is why we started to do it ourselves and get our own experts in. And we're learning as we go. To have a nationally accredited body, terrific.
Yeah. Just a lot of thanks coming through here. I'll just do a quick check and see if there's people have proposed, Andrew, that we get a t-shirt with you on it. And I think there's quite a few people who attended today that would agree with that. Yeah, I guess there's no major, I guess community-led development has been, has come up a number of times around providing opportunities for whānau hapu and communities, but also highlighted there is the fact that we often need, communities need training and support in order to be more participative, which I guess also applies to youth and children as well.
Mm. Mm.
Do you have any ideas about how we might, I guess, grow the capability and capacities of communities to lead their processes in these?
I was hearing Dr. Irwin today. We were lucky to have Professor Michael Baker come to our office, who's the epidemiologist we all see on TV now, talking about children and COVID, asked a whole lot of questions. It was Kathy who said that the government approach is top-down, policy strategically driven, but a particularly Māori and iwi-based approach is from the bottom up. Mm. And the two clash. Yep. And I think we're a bit outspoken here. I think we're in quite a statist country, by which I mean we have a high view of the power of the state. And in one sense, that's good. I mean, the power of the state to transform. But actually, I think we have too high a view of the state's power to do that, an unrealistic view. In any case, the state through different governments changes and waxes and wanes. Communities are there forever. I mean, I just know Etu Whānau because I've been seeing them recently, but that's an example of a community-driven process. Is it Mana Tamariki or Mana? Yeah,
Mana Tamariki, yeah.
There's a Porirua and a South Auckland. Yeah. I don't know if they're pilots, but community interventions that I just heard recently is about 86 or 88 Tamariki, is it, who've not been taken into state care because of that fantastic community-based wraparound support. So why we still need persuading of this in New Zealand, I'm not sure, but part of it is because government ministers and politicians and bureaucrats are, in the best sense, obsessed or at least seduced by an unflinching belief in the power of the state to do good in the lives of people. Yeah. But actually, whatever good the state can do, communities can do it far better, but they need money and resources. That's a message we've been slow to latch onto in New Zealand.
I think that's being echoed here. Sorry, the correction there is it's Mana Whānau is the Wesley Lifewise program. Yeah. Yeah,
you're right.
So thank you guys for that feedback. Yep, that's great. I guess I'll just leave you with one last question if we've got time. And that's around
I'm fine.
A focus on, with elections coming up and even about how the COVID budget's being spent, a lot of people are talking about numbers and how much money they're spending in this, that and the other area. So one of the questions really is about when people are proposing that we will fund this, that and the other thing, how do we push them into a conversation about outcomes or impact or benefit as opposed to purely the spend in that area? particularly for children and education and health?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. It's a fundamental question, and history's shown in New Zealand that we haven't been good at looking at outcomes. We're pretty good at looking at inputs. I mean, I'm just speaking in glib inputs of trite truisms now, but I think we're better at outcome measuring, and indeed the 7AA inclusion in Oranga Tamariki legislation has in it the obligation to measure on and report annually on outcomes and disparities. We haven't been so good at measuring outcomes. We could measure how much we put into OT and where it went and what we did. Paradoxically, we could never measure if children were better because of it. That's got to be the absolute starting point and end point.
Yeah.
I think the question is a great question, but it's the hardest thing to measure in a way, but it's the most important thing to measure.
Yeah.
It's the least measured.
Kia ora. I know we've got a bunch of questions, so we might post some of the residual questions that have come through in chat and Q&A into our Facebook page and ask some of your team to come on and maybe post some answers to that, or we might do it over email. But I would like to, just mihi to you, Judge Beecroft, for sharing the wero, the whakaaro and inspiration with us today. I think we could do a lot better as community organisations and researchers and government, and I think most of us would be deaf, dumb and blind not to hear that. I would like to acknowledge that we've all got challenges and opportunities to reimagine and build the communities and nations that will support future generations to thrive and reach their full potential. And our next webinar is on the 11th of September, which is this Friday, supporting the rainbow community and mental health. And while this is a health focus, this session is really a must view for people working in community organisations and in government who are often unaware of the range of identity diversity and how to consider this approach in the 21st century. So we've got Gloria, who's a recent doctorate graduate from Victoria University, now working with the DHB, Tabitha Besley from Inside Out, and Pooja Subramanian from Rainbow Youth presenting on this. So we'll send out a link to that on our Facebook site, and our October webinar is on community research ethics. So I think there will be a really good carry on from this, and maybe we can put it to the New Zealand Research Ethics Committee that we've got coming on to consider how those voices of youth and children are better met. So please, again, join our pages. You can subscribe to our monthly email and newsletter by emailing communications@communityresearch.org.nz. Thank you all for joining us today, and a video copy of our webinar with Judge Beecroft will be uploaded and shared later on this week. So I'd like to thank you again, Judge Beecroft, for your time. Ka nui te mihi ki a koe, kia koutou katoa. Hei kona.
The Community Research website offers a hub for good community research and researchers. It's the place for the public to find and share evidence about effective community practices. The website collects research and evidence and organises these so that they can be easily accessed and used by other groups. You can access this research and browse by category, by a list of quick link topics, or by searching for something specific. All of the research is free to download. The Community Research site is all about excellence and effective practices. You can view recordings of past webinars and find out about future ones. The webinars share evidence about what's working in the community sector. Published by Community Research in 2007, the Code of Practice provides the standards and guidelines for doing research. It's the place to start if you're thinking of undertaking research with or in a community or iwi. As well as the collection of research, we keep a register of experienced researchers who are skilled at working with iwi and communities. To find a researcher who can help you, we have a filter system which allows you to find people based on location, qualification, ethnic group, and area of expertise. The Community Research website is a unique resource for the community sector to use and share. It matters because communities who learn well will do well. It matters because it evidences what's working for us. For researchers and community people alike, we've made it as easy as possible to share your research on our website. Kaua e whakamā. Uploading material is quick and simple. Save your work as a PDF and head over to Share Research. Answer a few questions that help us tag and organize the research so it's easy for people to find. If you're a researcher and skilled at working with communities, you can add your details to the directory of researchers so that you can be found. Community research keeps you updated and informed. This helps make you more effective. If you want to stay updated about the latest research, informed about new resources and our upcoming webinars, head over to sign up for our e-news on the homepage. Community research is a rich resource built for and by the community. For it to reach maximum potential, we rely on you to contribute, participate, and support the resource to grow and thrive. Mā te kotahitanga e ora ai tātou.